Okay, so welcome all to Module 7 with Introduction to Web Programming. And today, what we're going to have a look at are HTML5 form new input types. So, in the last session, we talked about form tags. We also talked about how do we work form to get some input from the user. And once we have that input, we can also check, so before we store that input onto the server side, we can check whether that input is valid, right? And if that input can be stored centrally onto your server side. So we don't use the server side part because we are talking more on the HTML front, and that's how we're going to move ahead even today to have a look at more on the new input types which type gives, right? So to start off, as we have used some of the input types yesterday as well, right? If you remember, we talked about input type equal to email from validation. We will talk about that more in today's as well. Then we also talked about input type equal to number, and in that as well, we said that Chrome allows you to enter only numeric values, right? So that's from validation. But there are other input types apart from these two input types, which allow you to take some extra information from the user, right? And these input types were added to HTML5 because web or HTML was missing these features, and they were added to HTML5 as a specification, right? So let's jump in to see what we are going to cover in this HTML5 form new input tabs as a session. So, this course is brought to you by OdinSchool, which is a technology upskilling platform, and we help you continuously to acquire new skills. So, stay skilled, stay ahead. Hi, I'm Sumit Vijay Vajpayee. I'm a Microsoft certified trainer. I'm having 14 years of experience in delivering mean, moon, full stack technology, and other technology experts include Angular, React, Vue, GraphQL, MongoDB, Node, AI, and machine learning. Fine. So why do we need to learn new input types? Now, the reason why we need to learn new input types are, as I said, web was expected to have these, but HTML didn't provide any way of doing it. Let's say a very simple example, as we have discussed it earlier as well when we were talking about HTML5. So if we talk about input type equal to date, which is a new input type given to you by HTML5, prior to this, we used to depend on some third-party libraries. So it's a very simple control that is being used by most of the websites out there today, right? Let's say if you want to book a ticket, fine, you go to any site that allows you to book a ticket, you go back and select a date, and when you select that date, a calendar basically pops out, right? Now, if HTML5, when HTML5 was not there, we used to use two mechanisms. First was using server-side technologies for giving out these controls back to you. So when we worked with .NET, let's say, we had a calendar control, and which was a server-side control. Now, what used to happen was when the user would go back and select a particular date, the page would be refreshed because there would be a round trip back to the server because ASP.NET was providing you with a server-side control. So every time the user changes the date, page refreshes, which is not a good user experience, right? And that's the reason why we need to have some client-side mechanism. Now, because HTML5 was also not there, right? So what we had were libraries which basically allow you to have these controls or widgets to be used in. So there was jQuery, fine, which we used in. So if you remember, we had an look at a modernizer as an feature detection library, and in modernizer we had looked at this input type equal to date that Chrome was supporting, but then because I pasted that into my IE which was not supporting input type equal to date, then we use jQuery calendar for showing out the UI to it, right? So that's what we already covered, and that's the reason why we need to have these input types to be taken in, because you now have to have a better user experience when we work with web, because most of the things now are online and websites are having utmost importance in the era that we are talking about, and web is something which is an integral part of our life, right? So we want to make our application to be best in all the formats and the features that our application provides. Okay. So we're going to take all the features of HTML, HTML5, and the latest technologies that it give you. So let's learn how do you have this input types to be used. Now, there are different input types and that's what we are going to learn today, right? And use some new attributes with them, right? And we're going to also talk about field set, okay, which is there. Now, as we have done validation yesterday, when we're also going to talk about some of the validations with the other controls that you get in, and we have to work with that as well. So field set is a different tag. It's not directly an input element, but yes, it can be used in a form, and we'll be talking about it because it's also new with HTML5. So what are the new input types which are there? Now, as you can see, you have input type equal to date. So these are all the listed input types which are new with HTML5. So you have input type equal to date, date time, fine, which allows you to select the time format as well. Fine, then date time locale, okay, according to the local time. Then month, where you can select the month. You have time, fine, of the day. Then you have week, where you can select a week, fine. Then color, email, tell, search, range, number, and URL. Right? These are all the new input types that HTML5 gives you. Okay. Now I'm going to go back and have all of these things being used in. Fine. So we're going to have a simple example where all of these will be used, and we'll be using some of the properties, some of the attributes, as I've said, to make use of all of these input types in our HTML. So without further ado, let's go back and have a look at them practically. Now what we'll be doing, we'll be having a very simple example where we will be using all the tags that we have learned till now, right, and making use of them. So here I'm going to have a UI where, yeah, so have a UI where it's going to go back and specify my Visual Studio Code. I'm going to create a new folder, and that folder will be module 7. And in module 7, I'm going to create HTML5 new input types .html. So I go back and create new HTML5 page. That's how we created, as we have been using it right from day one. And here I'm going to have all my input types to be created. Now, just to give some introduction, okay, about how the things, how the styling and things will be done. Okay, we're going to have the styling to be done for each of the items that we're going to have it. So let's say from an semantic perspective, fine. So let's say from semantic perspective, I am going to make use of all the tags that HTML5 gives me newly from an input type, but I'm going to place it into a form, and that form is going to be put up into, let's say, an article, or maybe even an article and then other sections of it. So let's have an article, and in this article I'm going to have maybe an header. So this header tag, that's going to have HTML5 new input type. Now, in this HTML5 new input types, I'm going to have, now as you know, by default, this is by default not going to have any things on it until unless I put my heading tags into it. So let it be an h1 tag, and because it's in header, it will not be as bold as it would have been if I would have been directly putting it into the body section, right? So let's understand the first section. So the section which is going to have all of the different input types inside it, fine, is what is going to display. So initially, instead of just input type, I'm going to also start off and let you know a new HTML5 element which allows you to have an key value kind of pair to be associated. Like, now this is inspired basically from Windows applications. So if you have worked with VB, fine, or VB.NET and things like that, with Windows applications, you had this key and value. So normally that's called as label. So if I see, that's label. Now label is just a tag which contains some text. Now normally it is used for a form, right? Now as you have seen here, right, I'm not using any form, but yes, I'll be quickly adding the form into it, so I can maybe wrap this entire thing into a form. Now but the thing that I want to talk about right now is label. Now this label is a tag that would contain some text. Let's say I want to tell currently that what we're using is an HTML5 input type equal to number, let's say. Now for this, I'm going to say input type, I will say number. Now this label is just going to display a plain string. Till now we did not use label and we just went ahead and said input type and then say number, and then I would go back and specify input type is equal to number. Fine, that's what I was doing. But now instead of just doing this, I go back and make use of label, because this allows me to have a association with the form that I'm trying to map to. Okay, so the form control that I'm going to map to. So this label, you can see an attribute called as for, which basically means what is an attribute that it is going to point to. So if I just use this input type, okay, which is equal to text, I don't want text, but I want a number. So I'll say input type equal to number, and I'm going to give an ID to it. And as we know, ID is nothing but a unique identifier to it. I'm going to say, let's say txt number. And now what I do with this label is, with this for, I just mentioned the ID for label, right? So when I do this, what basically it means is this label, find the static text which you are using, you're using it for this particular type whose ID corresponds to txt number, right? Now before we move on, let me put this into a form tag. So I'm going to have a form, and I'm not going to have any action because I'm not submitting it anywhere, but yes, a form is something that I'll be having. Okay. Now this section, find that we write in, can have some styling. So let me go back and have, so let here the header be, now let this be again an header, okay, which basically says again an h2 tag or h3 tag, and which again would say input type equal to number. Fine. So maybe I'll just say enter number, okay, in a label, and let the heading be input type as number. So I may also want to style this, so I may go back and have some styling. Once, as we know, style is used for applying some styling, inline styling for any app, any particular element. And so let this be light gray, that be the background for that. Now even you may decide to have some height and width being set. So let's say the height that I'm setting to, let's say 200 pixels, and the width that I'm setting it to is, let's say 400 pixels. That's what I'm using it for my section. Let's see how does this view into the browser. So if I right click and say open with live server, fine, that's my new input type, right? So you can see the input type number, fine, and now I need to go back and enter a number here. Now as we saw it yesterday with input types, now you'll see before we go into that input type, what is the use of this enter number, fine, as a label. Now if you have a look at it, if I'm trying to go back and just refresh the page, there is no focus, okay, as of now. And if I click on this label, you will see the focus comes back to the corresponding text box, right? So the text box to which this label corresponds to, identified by the for attribute in the label, that's where the focus is going to be set. So you would say, okay, is this kind of mandatory? See, there are two things to it. One, when you talk about using a label tag, what it does, it basically allows you to have a better readability, okay, from the key colon value pair. But also what this label does, it increases what we call as accessibility. Right? Now what this accessibility as an thing mean is, in web, if I'm talking about web accessibility, accessibility means making your website available for everyone, including differently abled people. Right? Now when you target your website also should be accessible for differently abled people as well. Let's say there are visually impaired people or visually challenged people, then they may not see what we are trying to actually see this, right? So like for example, they may not see the images, they may be always dependent on an what we call as an associative or assistive technology. So the assistive technology that we talk about assistive technology like screen readers. So screen readers are something which allow you to read a page as if it is reading a book. Right? So screen readers are assistive technologies or tools, okay, which are there that differently able people use, and these tools try to read everything onto your web page. Now, if you are trying to put the text into your label, then screen reader will make sure that the label is being read. Otherwise, screen reader may also choose not to read that value. So label is not only from a key value pair, but label also helps you from accessibility perspective that makes your application much more accessible by differently abled people. Right? So that's the use of using a label. And as I said, if I'm clicking onto it, I want to correspond to a control that is there, I can do that. Now coming back to input type equal to number. Now when I use input type equal to number, I can go back and enter any numeric value, but not any other value. Fine. Apart from E, which I covered yesterday as well, because E can form a part of floating point, and that's the reason why E as a key is allowed. Okay, otherwise all other characters are kind of not allowed. So this input type equal to number. Now the thing that you need to remember here is when I'm trying to enter any non-numeric characters, okay, I'm trying to enter alphabet, but it's not allowing me to do that. This is what Chrome is behaving as a default behavior for input type equal to number. But if you talk about other browsers which may not behave in the same way, so let's check out what's the behavior for Mozilla Firefox. So here I'm trying to go back and have some non-numeric characters being entered, which Mozilla is allowing me to do, right? But the moment I come out of it, it checks the validation, right? And it says, yes, this is not a valid input that you have done. And you can see the validation, it's showing the red border for the text box that you've entered. So every browser, as I said, implements it in a different way, right? But so it's here Firefox is allowing you to enter non-numeric value, but it will not be valid value until unless I enter the value correctly and then come out of it. Now this is a valid value. So you need to be very sure about what are the things that every browser is kind of implementing, but you're sure that the page would still be working fine for your applications to use it. Now let me go back and just reduce this to 100 because 200 is we're not requiring it. And this input type equal to number is where I can go back and increment. So by default, you see the value being incremented. Now we have covered even the min and max, okay, specifying that you can specify the min and max attributes for input type equal to number, where it can restrict you the values of it. Now here, what I want to cover is, yes, I can go back and say min, okay, as let's say 10, and let's say max as let's say 100. Now with this, if I do this, as we have seen, I cannot go less than 10, fine. And if I'm going even more than 107, if I try to click on submit page, not on the full loss focus of it. So let me have a button, okay, for that to validate. In this form, say I'm going to have an input type equal to submit, fine, and then value as submit. We can use the button tag as well as we have covered yesterday. Okay. So if I enter some other value and try to submit, it says value must be less than or equal to 100. That's what is being mentioned. So 100 is possible, so that's inclusive of it. And when I'm saying now, if I increment, okay, if I'm incrementing the value, let's say I enter a value, let's say 40, and I'm incrementing, I can increment it by 1 because that's the default value. But there's an attribute called as step, which allows you to enter by how many values you want the values to step in once you click on that. So if I click on it, you can see it's incremented by 5. So that's what step does. So step is an incrementer, fine, with the value that you're trying to provide in, fine, and it will go back and perform an action of stepping. Now, it's not the fact that if I'm saying, if I'm trying to click submit, it says, please enter a valid value. The nearest valid values are 30 and 35. So you can see 32 is not a correct value because it's not referring to the next step. Okay, so that's also from a validation perspective that you can check out from the step prop or attribute that you give, which is new in HTML5. So that was about input type equal to number. Now, if I just go back and make use of other items, so like we have done with input type equal to number even yesterday, let's talk about input type equal to email as well, right? Now with this input type equal to email, I'm just going to copy paste the entire thing, except the fact that I'm going to change txt email, and I'm going to change this as well. I'm going to require input type equal to email. Then I'm going to get rid of this min max and things, and this txt email is what I'm going to paste. I'll say enter email. Now with this to work around, we do have a very simplest way, as I told you yesterday as well. Input type equal to email is something which allows you to enter a valid email address, but it's not as valid as you may expect, because if I'm trying to go back and see how this input type equal to email works in, so here the h3 is input type equal to email, enter email is what is being shown, and here when I'm trying to enter something, I'll say enter email to be, let's say, xyz, and if I try to click on submit, it validates, not having an @ sign, fine, so it has to be calling something. But if I click on submit, then that email address is considered to be a valid one because your page got submitted. Okay. So I would want to check, so I don't want only to check for the @ sign, fine, but I also want to check for the further line. So I want to check for .com, or maybe even I can go back and check for some domain specific thing, right? So let's say enter an email which is basically from Gmail domain. Now if that is the case, I need to go back and make use of the pattern. So as we discussed on pattern yesterday, fine, so I'll say txt email, let's say pattern, and I can use this txt email pattern for Gmail, right? And when I do this, what I can do is I can just go back and use a pattern, and in this pattern I can have a regular expression. So as we talked about yesterday, pattern is a new attribute with HTML5 from a validation perspective, and it allows you to validate a particular item and based on to the regular expression that you're passing in. So here I'm just going to go back and check whether it contains Gmail or not. Fine, so the string should end, fine, ideally, or should have this as a substring, which is gmail.com. So when I'm doing this and I go back to my UI for having this Gmail to be checked around, and in here I'm just going to go back and say enter email for Gmail. So if I say xyz, it will by default see that this is not a correct thing. If I say xyz add xyz, okay, again that's not matching the required format. But if I say xyz.gmail.com, so the point till I was mapping, so if you see till submit, now I'm in the focus of it till the point I reach @gmail.com. Now you see the error being gone because now the thing has been matched, right? And if I submit, page would be submitted because that's what my validation worked, and the pattern helped me to understand, okay, this is expected to have gmail.com at the end, fine. And again, as we discussed on yesterday, anything which I'm passing, so xyz at gmail.com is or may not be the correct form of it, okay, but the format is right. That's what I can check on the client side. But if I go back to the server side, I can check for sending a email onto the email address that's being entered by the user, and I can send a confirmation link there. The user clicks on that link, okay, when he goes back to his inbox and the tab opens up, then I can know, yes, he's a correct user and he's being validated again. Right. So that's how we make use of input type equal to email. Now, there's one more thing associated with this input type equal to email, which is along with pattern, I can also accept multiple entries format, right? Which is done by using multiple. Now, when I give multiple, I can go back and say, let's say Sumit at gmail.com, and I can give a comma, and provide some other values as well. So sumit@gmail.com and let's say anyone@gmail.com. If I do this now, you can see if I'm doing this, I do not see all the characters being entered in. Right now, you have a solution for that, but let's complete the multiple as of things. So if I just click on the submit, okay, you would see that the page got submitted, so that it is validated with the new attribute, which is multiple. Right now, how do you say that okay, I need to see all the items that he may be passing in, and that is done by using size, not length. Fine. So min length and max length, as we discussed on yesterday, will restrict you from the number of characters that the user is entering, whereas size allows you to how many number of characters are visible. So let's say if I say 35, for example, then you can see the size of this increased. And so I can go back and say sumit@gmail.com. Let's say comma, and I'll say xyz@gmail.com. So 35 characters can be shown at one go. That's what size can do, right? And that's how if I submit, the things are okay. Also, like we have worked with label, fine, as we have worked with label, which gives you information about okay, you should be entering a Gmail thing here, but you can also give some extra information to the user saying that you can enter multiple addresses as well. And if you want that, what you can do is there is a new attribute again that HTML5 gives you, and that's called as placeholder. Now in this placeholder, so this is size, this is multiple, this is pattern, and what this placeholder can do, it can give you information about some extra information that you're expecting. So here I can say enter comma separated list email IDs. So basically for Gmail. And if I do this, what you will see this placeholder does, you can see enter comma separate list of email IDs in here. And the moment I start typing, that placeholder goes off. It is just holding the name. Fine. Now you may choose. Now what people do is they get rid of this label and try to have this information to be shown here itself, right? But as I said, from accessibility perspective, that's not a better choice. Okay, even if you don't want to show the label, have the label, fine, make it invisible, fine, and then have the screen reader to actually read the value for it if you don't want to show the key and the value pair as well. So that can be done. So placeholders allow you to give extra information to the user, some watermark kind of thing that you can see here, and the moment I start typing in, that goes off. That's not the value. Okay, so if you still go back and access the value of it as we did with validation yesterday from JavaScript, and if I get the dot value property of this text box, that will still be an empty value. Okay, so you don't have to say that okay, this is the value of the text box. No, it is just a placeholder that's going to give extra information about the types of strings that you can just put in and give some extra information to use that format, and multiple emails can also be entered. So that's placeholder for you. And on the same lines, okay, like we had this input type equal to email, there exists another type which is input type equal to tell. So let me just go back, have this section and have input type equal to tell. Now what is input type equal to tell basically does is enter a telephone number, right? And txt tell, what I'm going to mark it, this txt tell is here, and here I will say input type equal to tell, right? That's a new HTML5 input type that kicks in. Now what this input type equal to tell does, if I just view it into the browser, I do have input type equal to tell being specified and enter a telephone number, which I can surely go back and do, right? But if I'm trying to enter any value in here which is not a telephone, that is still accepted, fine, because this is a generic telephone thing to it. So what you can do is you can validate it using a pattern, fine. And now you'll say okay, I can do this by input type equal to text as well. Then why is this input type equal to tell important? Now why is this input type equal to tell important? It's important from mobile devices perspective. So when you view this page into a mobile, and whenever the browser sees, okay, this is input type equal to tell, and the focus comes to that, it would pop out. So let's say let's say this is your mobile device, and let's say you are viewing the view page here, and once it sees, okay, this is input type equal to tell, fine, that's what you are trying to enter in, the focus is, it can pop up the contextual menu of your phone for the keypad, right, where you have the numbers, right? So you have 1, 2, 3, okay, all these numbers are there in your mobile. So this is where input type equal to tell would do. With input type equal to text, you do not get this. Okay? So input type equal to tell by default does not restrict you to say that, okay, I'm going to accept only numbers, fine, but yes, it can actually give some information to the browser in mobile devices, where we can have a keypad which is numeric specific thing, where you can dial in the numbers kind of thing, is kind of what input type equal to tell can do. So we can have patterns by default being matching as we did it yesterday. I am going to go back use, so you can see how important this pattern is, which we covered yesterday from validation perspective. So I'm going to go back in the same pattern as we did yesterday, 7, 8, 9. It can start off from that, and it can have digits which are 9 digits in question, and it should end it there itself. So now it would accept any of the values which satisfy this expression, right? Regular expression. Then we have input type equal to URL. So this is a simple section where we specified, okay, input type equal to tell, right? And then I could go back and make use of input type equal to URL. Now what is input type equal to URL does? This allows you to accept a particular URL. Now for this as well, fine, you would be wanting to have, so let's say if I say some pattern, because right now I'm not using any pattern. So let's see by default what this does. So I'm going to say txt URL, and that's the ID that I'll be using it for. And when I use my type is equal to, it should be URL. And when I visit my page, into this, enter the URL. Let's say if I just say XYZ and click on submit, now you see is please enter a URL. Now what is the format that this input type is kind of expecting? It's some text, fine, so let's say XYZ, fine, colon, / and then some text, okay, to be followed in. So that's basically a default pattern what it checks for. So here if I go back and make use of XYZ colon / XYZ, and if I click on submit, that's allowed, right? But I may not specifically want the user to just have this input type equal to URL being having XYZ colon something. I want to specifically check for, let's say, sorry, I want to specifically check for, let's say, HTTP or maybe HTTPS, then / and maybe then something to be followed in. So if I want this, again, what can be done? I can use pattern. So by default, it does not check for HTTPS to be present in it, because it can check for any of the strings which are present. But yes, I can make it to follow some pattern that I'm expecting, again by using a pattern as an attribute. So let's come back and have this pattern being used in, where into this URL, I would just say pattern and specify HTTPS colon / and then the dot and then star, meaning it can have any other thing after it as well. So here from my validation, if I just enter XYZ, okay, colon something and XYZ, now this was valid earlier, but now it says please match the requested format, which ideally must be starting with HTTPS. So if you want, you can even go back and have the placeholder fine being mentioned. I'll just be copying it here. Pattern that must be matching is HTTPS / and then some code. Here I'll say, you can see enter HTTPS colon, I'll say HTTPS colon / let's say XYZ. Now I'm happy that okay, you have entered HTTPS minimum and then the URL is kind of an valid. Okay. So by default URL does give you the validation, but it does not check for the keys which are there. It just checks for some text, colon, // some text. And that's where again this pattern can help you to do a better validation onto your file. Now on the same lines, fine, as we have been working with this different input types like URL and things, we also have input type equal to search. Now the input type equal to search, what it basically does, when I'm trying to have a search term, you can see in today's world how important it is to search anything, right? So not only Google search, but also anything, any website that you visit in. Let's say you are going back to a documentation site where you want to search something onto it, or if you're going to, let's say, Bootstrap, you want to search for components. So searching is something which is kind of very important from an application perspective, and that's where this enter a search as an thing comes in. So when I'm trying to enter a search, okay, I would try to have a search term being accepted. Now we'll talk about the difference, what it basically does, because search term here, and now I'll get rid of the pattern as of now, and I'll just say txt search type search as a new type input type. Now what this does by default, now if you go back and see how Chrome is behaving, enter a search term here, and let's search for Google. Now what you see here is, it is if I try to click on submit, fine, it will still be validated, and there is no problem into it, because a user should be allowed, you can use pattern, not a problem, but user should be allowed to search anything, right? And that's why using pattern here may not be always the right choice, but it may differ, fine, depending on your scenario, what you're working on. So I'll not be using any pattern here, but if you see the difference, so you'll say, then what's the difference between input type equal to search and input type equal to text? Because I could have achieved this by using input type equal to text. Yes, but what you see here is, if I'm typing something, you can see because this is input type equal to search, by default Chrome is giving me a mechanism of having a cross icon being given, because I can go back and choose not to search this item but a different one, right? So if I just say Google, hit enter, fine. If I just go back and write something else, hit enter, fine. So you can see everything is kind of valid. But if you see this behavior with Firefox, so let's understand. So we understand, okay, the moment I enter search term, there is an button that kicks in, or icon that kicks in, which I can click, and the search term is gone. Now if I just talk about Firefox, fine, so I'll just be refreshing this, and if I go back to this input type equal to search, fine, which is here, I'm wanting to have this search being done. Let's say I go back and say Google, fine. Now you see here Firefox is not showing you the cross-in, because that's not how by default it is implementing, but it does something which is different than Chrome, right? So what it does, if I hit enter Google here, right, go back, and if I try to say XYZ as well, hit enter, and if I go back and say G, can you see the autocomplete thing kicking in, right? So that's what happens with input type equal to search with Firefox. Okay, so it may not go back and give you the cross sign, which is what the Chrome is doing by default, but it can go back and give you intelligence of the search items that you have already done, which doesn't happen with input types, input type equal to text, unless you enable the autocomplete feature. And so there's also an autocomplete attribute being given. Fine, so that's what all these input types can also make use of. But by default, there is an autocomplete type for input type equal to search if I'm trying to make use of it in. So these were some of the tags. Now let's see other tags input types as well, okay, which have come up and which were not available earlier with the web environment, right? Now here I'm going to go back and copy this, paste it here. Now the next thing which we are going to have a look at is input type equal to color. So that's name, so I'll say txt color. Say enter a color here, or select a color here rather. So this input type equal to color gives you a new color picker, right? That's what. So there is no use of placeholder in here, because that's just kind of a button being shown into the UI. So input type equal to color is what this is going to show you. Now if I just go back into my UI coming back to, let's say, Firefox or even for Chrome, right, I would just be using this button. So if I click onto it, you can see palette, the color palette being selected. Now you can even go back and give your RGB values, fine, to be there. You can even go back and mention the HSL, find the hex value, anything that you're wanting to have. So if I, let's say, FF AA and let's say 11, that's the color that actually comes out this value. So even I can go back and select, and as you can see, and different ways in which you can provide the values, hex, RGB, or even the HSL, the hue, saturation, and things that you can provide. Now here, when I'm trying to provide or select a particular item onto it, so you can see this also works in the same way, except the fact that now it's a normal Windows color dialog box that's actually coming up, as you do with other Windows based applications like Photoshop and other things which are there, okay, or even MS Paint and things like that. So you can select the color, fine, and just use the value property of it. Now if you want to do that, okay, let's do it. So what I can do, maybe I can have this section identified by, let's say, an ID, right? And I would say section for color. That's an ID. Now what I'm going to do, there is a default event, fine, associated with this color that's called as onChange, right? Now you can set an section item for it, or maybe you can set other things of it. Anything that you want to select, okay, can be done. So here I'm just going to go back and have this input type equal to color to handle an event. Right now, when we go to JavaScript, we'll see more of it, but here just what I'm going to change, I would tell you that you can go back and specify the section item, okay, which is this section color dot style. Now right now you'll see the background color as light gray, but I would want the background color, right, to be equal to the value coming from the txt. So I can even go back and say this dot value. Now what is this corresponding to? It's going to correspond to the current input item, which is the color. So let's save and see if that's what happens. So if I click on OK, if I select some item, click OK, that's what is happening. You can check it with Chrome as well. If I select this, fine, and on the change of it, I would see the input type equal to color being mentioned in the manner that I'm. So that's how I can work with JavaScript. So if this is kind of confusing, just ignore this as of now. Just wanted to tell you that not only changing the value but also consuming it is also important from an HTML perspective. And I've not written any JavaScript. I've just written a single line where it identifies the ID dot style dot the background color to be changed with this dot value, and where this is actually going to correspond to this current input type, right? So that's another input type which we can use it. Now the next input type that is there is input type equal to range, right? So here I'm going to get rid of this ID. I'm going to have input type equal to range. Now for this input type equal to range, let's say you're displaying a salary, fine, where you want to have an information from the user that what's his expected salary, right? Or any range, anything that you given, not only salary, let's say expected kind of population in the city that he resides in, or you're just taking a census and knowing how many number of people are residing. So it can be for any of applications where you are having a range from one minimum value to the maximum value, and you can use this input type equal to range in here. So this is txt range. I'll copy this. This is color, and now I'll get rid of this, which I don't require. I'll just select a range, and I would type equal to, right. Now here I can go back and view what this range is. Now here by default you will not be seeing any value. Now it is not having it because you can see it is being not showing any value, but it's just a slider control, and where some values can be selected and being used, but there is no value to be referred as of now because you have not given what we call as the min and max, right? So let's say we are expecting a salary, so I can say the min as 20,000 and let's say max as 2 lakhs. Now when I change this slider control, you can again see the value is not being changed. But if you see different browsers behaving in a different way, if I just see this as well, if I come back, then even you can see the way how Firefox is showing the slider control is different than how Chrome is showing. And if I just go back to the Edge, to understand if the Edge is also showing it in the same way, I will just open it up. And here you can see it's like your Chrome, fine, as top. Yes, so you can see it's like Chrome, fine, but it's using a different color scheme as well. It's gray here as well, it's a blue. But the thing is, how can I understand? Now here again you have to use the value attribute because it's input type equal to range, so the value can give you the value output. Now if you want to show that thing, what I'll do is in this section itself I'm going to have another tag which is basically used. So just use output, fine, and I will give this output to contain some text. Okay, let's say this is the range output, and whenever I select, this will again be on change, right? I can have this output ID to be selected like range output. I'll say range output dot, I will specify the way how my value for my output should be changing. So this will be again value, so range output dot value equal to this dot value. So if I come back to Chrome, what you will see is this range. There is the maximum, there is the minimum. Okay, you can even have step in between that you are incrementing the value for. So you can go back and use step, let's say 1000, fine. I can go back and have 48,000, 61,000. You can see 1000 is the step that is trying to increment. Okay, so that's how you basically see. Now if you try it out with different browsers, let's say with Firefox, that's how it's supporting. So you can see this input type equal to range allows you to have a range from a minimum and the maximum, and you can go back and give a range. Now comes those controls which are related with calendar control, right? So let's see this section. I'll just copy, go back and use it for calendar control. Now for this I need to go back and say input type equal to date. So I'll select date, and this txt date, where we can enter, let's say, date of birth and things like that, and we have this input type equal to date with txt date being value. I'm not handling any event now. That is just for you to understand that you can consume the values. And when I select this, I come back and see input type equal to date is what is popping. because I don't have any stylings to be done, because I don't want this to go off thing, using some break statements, that it is in within this client area. So October 2020, you can select which date you want, okay, June, fine, May, any of the values that you're trying to. So you can just go back, specify the value to it, and for coming back, it'll just be the date it's been, and even cross it so that it goes back to the original one. Now this date is shown differently in your Firefox. If you go back to Chrome, that's how it pops up. Fine. If the value is having upstairs, so there is no value downstairs, that's why it's popping up, and that's how the Chrome is going to show it. And if you have a look at Edge, that's how Edge shows the value as well. So this is something which is not supported by your IE, which is Internet Explorer. Fine, so InputTypicallyTell would not be working in. Fine, so this was InputTypicallyTell. Now that there are variations to it, like in the same lines, if I go back and have input type equal to date time, fine, then you have week. So let's say, for example, let's consider week. You can explore more on to the different variations which are having. So they are on the same line: week, date time, local, fine, and you have type week as well. Okay, that's all actually on the same thing. So I'll say week date. I'll copy this txt week date, and here I'm going to go back and say week. So when I select a week, back to Chrome, you see it allows you to select the week number, and you can select the month, you can select the first week. So all these are given to you as a variation of input type equal to date, right? And as I'm saying, you have input type equal to week, just a date, you have date time local, and you have month as well. Okay, so when I do that, I obviously will be selecting a month from it, fine, and I just want to know in which month that this kind of occurred. There are different variations that you can try out. Okay, as I've told you, this is date, this is week. You can also check out for date time and time local to cover. Now, apart from these input types, okay, which are kind of new with HTML5, and as you can see, most of these will be used in the web for some of the purposes, and web was missing these input types, and HTML5 adds these input types to the UI. And when I'm using these input types, I make sure that these input types are having also pattern associated with it, okay, so that I can perform some formatting validations on itself, and that is the best practice to. But apart from these, there also exists another tag which is associated with the form, but it allows you to segregate. It allows you to separate the items from each other. Now, for that, let's jump back to the next slide, which is HTML5 field set. So this HTML5 field set is allowing you to group related items in a form. And for that, what you use is a tag called as field set. So field set tag draws a box around the related items. Now this is same, or you can say it is inspired from the way that we used to have coding in your client setting, or rather I'll say from Windows application. So group box is something what we used in when we try to make use of this field set. So we used to use in the applications which were basically Windows applications, okay, in VB or VB.NET and things like that. We used to use something called as group box, which used to group a particular set of items and have that to be used. Now field set is kind of again new, and you have the legend tag, which is used to define a caption for the field set element. So let's have a look at how do we use it. Now, if I jump in back into this, I'm going to have a different section altogether. Now let this section not have the background and other things. Let that be okay, because I'm going to have do this by using the field set itself. Even I don't want to have the section as well, I can do it by using the field set directly. So let's do that. So when I say field set, I'm going to go back and have this field set to have, let's say, some information about the user. So I'll say legend and I'll say user billing info. Right? I'm going to have some billing information for the user, let's say, to be shown in. And what I'm going to have for that is, which I'm going to have a label, right? And I'm going to go back and say, let's say, for example, house number. And I'm going to have some house number being entered. Let me have it for input type equal to text. So all of this I'm going to use just input type equal to text, and here ID would be txt house number. So that's what I'm going to paste. Now, apart from these, I also make use of, now because I'm not using any styling, I'm just using breaks for having, yeah. So I'll just paste this txt street number, street, let's say city, the city name, that thing, and let's say one more item I'm going to have for txt pin. Here I have the pin code entered in by the user. So everything is going to be just same, except that street number should change to this. The city, txt city, should be matching it to the txt pin code. Now, for these items, now if I'm trying to view this into the browser, that's how my field set looks like. So let me go back to Chrome and come back in here. That's how user billing info is shown me in the UI. Basically forms a group box, and in this group box, okay, we say that it is going to have the information of, so this is basically categorizing the list of items that you're having onto your page, right? So you may have billing information, you may have customer information, personal details, okay, like username and other things that you want to have in. It may have its profile file where it has the image and other things onto it. So there can be n number of things which you can think of for using this field set as an attribute. So the moment I'm trying to make use of these field set, okay, that HTML5 gives me, it allows me to have a categorization of the number of field items which I'm trying to, right? Okay. So going back to presentation, so we made use of the field set, we made use of the legend as well, and what we have seen in today's session, we learned about new input types. So the new input types are input types which allow you to have the things which were not present earlier, and now HTML5 fills in those gaps, and you can make use of those fields out of the box, and you don't have to depend on any library for doing such thing. Now I have also shown you an mechanism which is called as modernizer in the previous sessions, fine, and in that we saw if the browser is not supporting these input types, then how we can go back and have modernizer to be used in. So if you want to have a look at it, you can surely check out my previous videos and you'll be getting the solution for that. How do you do it? Then we also talked about some new attributes, fine. So all the input types that we saw, we also saw some new attributes, like we have used min and max yesterday, but yes, those are new attributes from HTML5 perspective. We have seen placeholders, we have seen multiple, fine, we have seen step. So these were some new attributes that HTML5 gives you with your input types that kicks in. And then we also had a look at what is a field set, and field set is a group box which allows you to have categorization of your HTML input types in a form to be divided into different categories, right? Okay, so these were the things which I wanted to let you know in this HTML5 session with HTML5 new input types. find there. You can go back and explore and do the hands-on. I'll be making this thing available as a hands-on in the description below, and you will have the code available for you to tweak in, and you can just try it out. So please do the hands-on, please try it out. If you have any questions, if you have any comments, you can surely let us know in the comment section. So please do not forget to like and subscribe, and I thank you all for being patient and listening to me patiently. So thank you, have a good evening, see you tomorrow at 5:30.